session in our Hay and Pasture School series, um, brought to you by Cornell Cooperative Extension of all 6 northern counties. We have with us tonight Jonathan Barter. He is here from the American Solar Grazing Association, which has a pretty good concentration of folks of active members in New York State, but it's actually nationwide. And Jonathan, maybe there's people around the world, but Jonathan's here to talk to us about grazing beneath solar arrays. He has been in the past 20 years a farmer. He's worked with Soil and Water Conservation District and NRCS, and he's been a board member of the American Solar Grazing Association for the entire time I think it's existed, and he works for a solar development company. So he's here with us tonight. I am handling his slides, so I'll try to do that smoothly for Jonathan to speak from. Take it away, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Kitty. Yeah, I wasn't sure how much background to give Kitty versus giving some background for myself. And I really wasn't quite sure until probably 20 minutes ago who I'd be speaking to in terms of the demographics of the audience. And I'm still not entirely sure, but I'm led to think that it's primarily farmers, plus some CCE folk from some of the counties up in the North Country, some of whom I think I'm familiar with to some extent, because when I was with Soil and Water and NRCS, I did interact quite a bit with CCE, but I don't remember Kitty too well, but that's okay. Yeah, so you can, I don't want to say too much about myself, but you know, folks always tell me you've got a different accent. So yes, my accent's a little bit different. Actually, I grew up in Scotland. My degree I obtained from the University of Aberystwyth in Wales, and I was born in England, so I've been all over the UK. I still consider UK home, although I've been living in the States for over 30 years. Whenever I go back to Scotland, I feel like I'm going home. So that's my background. And I say that a little bit intentionally because my background is grass farming. My interest has been on grass farming ever since I went to university. And the farming experience I've had has been based on grass largely, and primarily beef cattle and sheep. So it seemed a fairly natural fit many, many years down the road that I found myself doing what I'm doing now. As Kitty said, I was a grazing specialist. Not that I want to make a big deal of that job description, but I got quite into developing grazing plans for farmers, primarily because they were interested in getting some funding for fencing and other projects for grazing systems. It was an opportunity, of course, for me to widen my experience both culturally and technically, which is very helpful. But I got to the point where I was ready for a change. And at that point, I met a young, well, I'll say a young woman called Alexia Hain, who was speaking very enthusiastically about the solar grazing potential that was what was happening in 2017, 2018. And after various conversations, she and I and a couple others became founding members of ASCA. Not that this presentation is going to be primarily to promote ASCA. I don't want it to be that way, but I think it's helpful to know what ASCA is all about. We're in a solar development sort of evolution, I think it's fair to say, and ASCA in the early stages of that has taken a very active role, and really to the benefits of the industry, because we've seized an opportunity that we're trying to capitalize on. And I'm sure in the North Country, as well as throughout the country of the United States and beyond, solar is becoming an increasing issue on the landscape, and for the good or ill. Some folks are not altogether happy about it, and some folks are absolutely thrilled about it, and some of us fall in the middle. It has good and bad like everything else. But the whole rationale for ASCA, of course, if you haven't already realized this, is that we see it as a means of keeping all the acres that are being taken over by solar as being utilized for agriculture, and not taking agriculture out of the picture. As we're seeing now, and we will continue to see over the next probably 10 years, I'm going to project, a lot more acres are going to be put under panels, solar panels, and we either resign ourselves to those panels being managed by lawnmowers or managed by livestock, and the livestock that makes the most sense by far and away is sheep. And I don't want to assume that that's not obvious. It is very intentional. When people say, well, what about cattle? And it is being experimented with. Some folks have tried and are trying to put beef cattle on solar sites, but there's problems. Cattle like to rub against things, rub against expensive infrastructure, that can cause problems. But I'm getting away from myself here a little bit, and I will maybe just explain at the outset here. The slide presentation here was done by a colleague of mine on the board, on the ASCA board, who presented this, as you can see from the date, last year. He's a wool enthusiast. He actually lives in Maine, and I'm not a great one for PowerPoint presentations, and I knew what he had done, and I asked him to send me this. So we're going to go through this. We're going to go through this presentation because it covers a lot of the important aspects of solar development from a general perspective. Depending on time, I do have some slides which I might attempt to show you of my own experiences since I got into the industry 5 years ago. So, Kitty, if you want to go to the next slide. And I will say this, I am entirely happy for anyone to jump in and ask a question. I don't particularly enjoy just talking. I like to know that folks are not just listening, but are being provoked to ask a question or disagree with me, and that's absolutely fine too, because that makes me feel like I'm getting the message across or provoking thought. So back to using animals versus lawnmowers on sites, and perhaps a little bit of clarification. I think this comes further on the presentation here. These sites, and I'm assuming in the North Country you're seeing this happening. I'm pretty sure that there's some going on as we speak. You don't have to travel too far east, west, north, or south. We've got folks in Ontario, Canada, who have been grazing for several years up there on solar sites. So it seems to be happening across the board, whether it's in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New Jersey, Maine, Massachusetts. It's going on all over the Northeast. And it will continue to gain momentum over the next, as I said, 5 to 10 years. It's going to be a lot of activity. So the problem from the very outset is, once you put these things on the ground, what do you do to maintain it in terms of the vegetation? And it is very important, goes without saying really, that vegetation can be a hazard. Once you see a little bit of shading on those panels at the bottom, it affects all the panels above that. And I can't give you the percentage of loss of energy production, but it's quite significant. I've seen figures of 40 to 70% loss on that row of panels. So when you have vegetation that's growing too high and shading because of the sun, position of the sun, you jeopardize the efficacy of those panels. So the consequence or the conclusion is, we've got to keep this vegetation controlled. And as I said, the two options are, three options, I suppose. You can spray it with Roundup or something similar to that. You can use a lawnmower, or you can use an animal, a ruminant. And of course, I am here to push the value of using animals, not just because they do a great job, but because of the ecological, environmental factors, and because it makes sense. I don't know if I have to make the case for grazing, but I've been a grazer for a lot of years, and I've been a fan of the whole ability of a ruminant to take grass, which is such a prolific crop, and utilize it and turn it into wool or meat or milk. So the title for this slide here, using livestock as a tool to manage vegetation and improve soil health and function. And we get asked this question all the time. What's the benefit of having animals grazing on this site versus a lawnmower? And we say, well, it improves the soil health and function. And a lot of people say, well, so what? I don't really care about that. So it's really incumbent on us to be able to understand and explain more than just, well, animals can cut the grass just as well as lawnmowers. What actually can they do? And I'm not here to educate you, because I'm assuming that all of you to some degree are educated about that. But that question is going to come up more and more and more. So what? And what do we say? If we are interested in promoting sheep over lawnmowers, what do we say? And that's a thought provoker a little bit. Some people don't care, and that's okay. But for those of us who care, I think it's important to know why sheep are an excellent option for grazing on solar sites. Because if we believe in the value of grazing in a commercial farming system, then we should have no problems promoting it in the context of a commercial solar site. Next slide. And I'm going to assume that you can all read this. And these are some of the reasons for grazing versus other means of weed control, vegetation control. We talk about fire hazards, we talk about maintenance costs. I'm going to assume there might be some folks who will ask the question, well, what does it cost to put sheep on a solar site? And I hope if we have time, we can talk about that later on in this presentation, because it's really worth considering. If some of you tonight know somebody, or you yourselves may be thinking about the possibility of doing this, yes, it's a good idea, but it's a good idea with some provisions. There's pros and cons, like there are with everything. But I think we need to know why we're doing it, not just because we think we can make a quick buck. And perhaps we can clarify that later on as we go on. So I've talked about the shading. I've done some mowing of solar sites, and I have cracked some panels, so it's not too difficult to do, even if you're very careful. And I think to myself, yes, we should just have sheep on all these sites, because very rarely do you see damage being sustained by sheep on a solar site. And going back to other animal sources, we talked about cattle a little bit, and folks say, what about goats? Well, if any of you know about goats, goats have an amazing ability to jump on panels and possibly crack the glass there, but also they have a wonderful curiosity in all the wiring on the back of the panels, and they'll tend to check it out a little bit too closely, and we've seen some chewed wires, which doesn't work too well with the solar developers. And I'll be happy for anyone to ask questions about that later on too. Next slide, please. And yeah, there are, we talk about dual use, and we talk about agrivoltaics, combining agriculture with photovoltaics, with solar systems. And that is our main thing, to promote the idea that we can utilize energy production and agricultural production in harmony. And this little slide shows that there are some alternatives. There are some folks, not so much in the United States at this point, certainly other parts of the world, where they are attempting to grow other crops under the panels. I have seen combine harvesters going underneath the panels. They have to be built a lot higher, of course, to facilitate that, but it is happening. There are some folks doing different cropping systems under panels. On a large scale, I think the jury's still out on that one, the viability of it. And perhaps when I talk a little bit more about the size of sites and the scale, it makes more sense to think on a small scale. Yes, we can graze rabbits, and we can graze chickens, and we can grow some vegetables, but once you get into a scale scenario, it becomes a whole different animal, which probably excludes a lot of the wonderful ideas that some of us may have about what we can do under these panels. If you haven't seen, some of these panels have what we call a fixed axis. Some of them have a rotating axis, so they're actually moving through the course of the day to absorb the sunshine, which does make them a little bit more efficient. Maybe gain 10 to 15% more energy. Some of these panels also are what they call bifacial. They're actually gaining light from underneath, and that actually is amazingly efficient too, and adds 15 to 20% for efficiency there. So these the technology of solar development is improving rapidly. So it does, I think it does make us force us to say this is here to stay for a while. I don't want to get into the discussion how long is solar going to be a big deal, but for right now, for the foreseeable future, it is a rapidly developing industry. It is becoming more and more efficient. And you hear some of the statistics about solar versus other more conventional forms of electrical generation, and it's gaining in leaps and bounds. Next slide, please. And this is a very useful slide to demonstrate at the scale factor, and it without interpreting the whole thing. The point is that whatever you do on that solar site, particularly in terms of agriculture, it becomes more and more efficient the bigger the site becomes. So if the opportunity is for me to start promoting specifically sheep grazing on solar sites, the efficiency factor increases as the size of the site increases. And based on the renewable energy incentives and targets that are in place in most states in America, we are going to see the size of sites rapidly increase from the smaller 1 to 5, possibly to 10 megawatt sizes, to the what we now call utility scale sites, which can be anywhere from 100 to 300 to 400 megawatts. Enormous sites, enormous amounts of land suddenly being taken over by lots and lots of panels, which of course evokes a reaction. And I'm hoping that, you know, my little effort here and my colleagues, many of us in this industry, are trying to say, well, don't get too reactionary yet. You know, try and think of it objectively. That's what we're trying to do in the sheep grazing industry, because we can make quite an efficient, quite a sustainable system on some of these big sites. And I'd far rather see 5,000 sheep on a site than 20 guys with lawnmowers on that site a couple of times a year. Happy to talk about that later if there's any interest in that. Next slide, please. So here's some of the, I mean, I'm sure everybody wanted to see some pictures of sheep, and just a little demonstration of some of the systems that are in place that some of my colleagues are using. Obviously, the slide on the left there shows some electrified netting, which is a pretty typical way of breaking up sites to create small paddocks. So for those of us who graze, rotational grazing systems, I think, are just as important. And we at ASCA are very bent on promoting best management practices, which certainly includes rotational grazing on some level. It may create some complications working with the solar development company whose site it is and who signed the contract that the sheep producer is working with. But when when the project's on the ground, there are many ways that people use to break up sites so that you can provide rest periods and utilize those typical agronomic practices that promote better grazing, better grass production, better stocking rates. A typical question folks have when they're thinking about putting sheep on a site is, well, how many sheep can you put on a site? And for those of you who are grazers, well, I'm sure you know that it's based on lots of things. It's based on fertility, it's based on the quality of vegetation, and familiarizing yourself with the almost, dare I say, the personality of the landscape, and the subject or the susceptibility to seasons and seasonal variations. You in the North Country are a little bit different to where I am in the southern tier of New York. We all have different growing seasons, and then within ASCA, we're working with folks throughout the country. So we have a lot of folks on large operations, large solar grazing operations in places like California and Arizona and Texas, where it's completely different. So you might have a 2,000 acre site, and you have to decide, well, how many paddocks do I want to create on that? But I wanted to show this site so you can see a little bit of the examples of how folks break sites up. I myself, in what I have done, I didn't really tell you how I got into this industry, but I started to tell you that I was getting a little bit, I wouldn't, maybe I shouldn't say bored. I wanted more of a challenge. Meeting with Alexia Hain and some others, we formed ASCA. At the same time, I actually met a chap who had just recently started a community solar development company based out of New York City, and I saw the opportunity. So I said, well, how about I help develop a solar grazing program for your company, and the rest is history. And that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years. And we have sheep, and we've been experimenting. There's been a learning curve. I have used electrified netting myself. I don't personally like it too much. It's good in some contexts, not in others. Again, this may or may not come up later in conversation. I'd be very happy to talk about that. I have used some permanent fencing. I've used 36-inch or 30-inch woven wire with 20 foot row spacings, relatively inexpensive, just to break a site up, break up a 20-acre site to 2 or 3 paddocks. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about water later. So maybe I should have mentioned in that one picture on the top right, where you've got a few weeds growing there, and you've got the above ground wiring there, which creates problems. It's all about how much does it cost to build a site, and the solar development company are usually profit driven. So the cheapest way they can do anything, they will, and that is a cheaper way than burying the wires that connect up all the rows of panels. It creates problems for people who are using lawnmowers. It just makes the case a little stronger for using sheep, and I can tell you that firsthand, that sheep work much better around these than lawnmowers do. Next slide, please. There's another example of above ground wiring, another way that some folks have used their electrified netting. There's no one way to do anything. It's all about being resourceful, innovative, and doing what works, because the way these sites are generally set up, you have to work around that. Unless the solar company, which does happen, and we're trying to make this happen more often, the solar company decides from the very outset, from the planning stages, that they want to use sheep rather than not even think about what the vegetation control program will be. And then they can start planning to design a site around a solar grazing system. That makes it much more interesting, much more efficient, and much more attractive to a sheep producer. And that affects water. And we can talk about water later again if there's time, because I have not timed how long this presentation will take, and I'm going to blather on until we're done. And then if there's time for questions, then we'll do it. So next slide, please. As I was saying, just exactly what I was talking about, cracked glass, top left, not easy, not difficult to do, stones flying out from the lawnmower. Those panels do shatter very easily. The middle slide there is a classic example of a site that was built without thought of drainage issues, without thought of erosion issues, and you can see there was a heavy rain. It just caused terrific erosion, a big issue, and this is sort of has been the learning curve for solar development companies, where people like us can intervene and say, look, maybe you should think about doing it a different way. How about this way? Putting some erosion control measures in early on, such as on an agronomic level. I'm very into grasses and grass mixes, particularly for erosion control. You know, I would have probably said, let's put some rye or annual ryegrass on that site before you even built the site. Instead, you've got chronic erosion. It discredits the company, but you know, we can address that. The top right picture, well, I mean, it speaks for itself. How much loss of efficacy are those panels experiencing because of those weeds coming through the panels? And I have dealt with situations not unlike that. It's not a really extreme picture, that one. It's a little bit tragic, but it does happen. That is the need for vegetation control. And I'm thinking from that slide, it looks to me a little bit like thistles there. Maybe those who can see that better than I can might say, well, maybe it's not thistles, but whatever it is, it's something that is not being controlled, and it's an issue that you have to address sometimes with sheep, because for those of you who know sheep don't necessarily eat everything. That's where goats are quite attractive. And sheep will often not eat some of the plants that are growing on solar sites based on the history of the solar site. And we may have to deal with that for the first year or two or three. Knowing the history of the site is very important. Unfortunately, a lot of the solar development companies, in their agreements with local townships, do not use chemicals. And so, as easy as it would be to throw in some Roundup to take care of that, that's often not permissible. So we have to come up with other solutions. As you can see on the bottom right picture, that particular mowing machine is designed to fit under the panels. So there's equipment being built now that makes it more efficient to graze to cut, to mechanically control the vegetation. So we've discovered that we're in a bit of a competition with those people who like to sit on a tractor or a zero-turn lawnmower, which is a shame. So it's like it's become very incumbent on us to continue to present a compelling case for the virtues of livestock over machinery. And it comes back all the time to what's the benefit to the environment, what's the benefit to the soil, et cetera, et cetera. And we keep coming back to that. Nutrient control. I've had questions from departments of health saying, what about the migration of nutrients from these sites if we have sheep on there? So it makes us think about how do we address that. For those of you who are familiar with nitrogen cycles, good manure management in grazing scenarios, it's all good things to have under your belt to give compelling, plausible answers to folks who come up with objections that may or may not have very much credibility at all. Next slide, please. I think I wanted to, I mean, it's nice pictures, nice sheep. And I don't know if there are folks watching this who have thought about what kind of sheep do we use, quite apart from the stocking rates. But some people are much more interested in the breeds of sheep. And I don't want to necessarily dwell on that. I mean, any sheep will work, frankly. Any sheep that's suitable for the region that you're in. There is certainly a strong trend towards hair sheep. I'm sure folks are familiar with hair sheep, primarily Catardins or Dorpers or crosses. In the bottom right-hand picture there, one of our ASCO colleagues, she's on the board of advisors in New Jersey. She has a pretty substantial sized flock of Catardins, and there are, of course, benefits for that. My colleague who put the slide presentation together is a great advocate for wool breeds. And he's made a very compelling case for the benefits of seeing solar development to promote wool production. And he may have a very good case for that too. But and perhaps that's a subject of conversation for another day. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we're getting more to the sources of our information and where to go with questions. Folks who are being very active in this industry, in the academic arena, particularly, and then the political arena. It's been quite an eye-opener for me to see all the entities who have become so invested in this solar grazing endeavor that ASCO has become a part of. I mean, we've become participants in some pretty big conventions throughout the country. Not to laud ourselves in that, but to say that ASCA is becoming a recognized entity, so that what we say is making a difference. What we do is having some impact. And like I said, I didn't want to make this presentation a promotion for ASCA, but what I will say is that ASCA has got some pretty unique and compelling data on its website. One of the most interesting ones that we've got right now is a map of the development of solar throughout the country that a lot of our sheep producers and a lot of our solar developers who are members of ASCA have contributed to. So we can now pinpoint where solar development is going on, where there are sheep producers, where there are sheep producers grazing under solar, and where there are sheep producers who want to graze under solar. So it's creating a network, and enables the two folks to get together and say, look, we're building a 500-acre site in Ohio, and we've got some folks, you know, an hour away. Well, let's contact them and let's see if they're interested in grazing this site. There is more and more rumblings, at least, of the solar industry starting to cater to grazing over mowing. And in some of the political arenas, we're seeing more incentivization to promote sheep over mowing. In fact, I think one state at least at this juncture are making it mandatory to put sheep on sites, unless there's no options to do that. I won't say which one that is, but I think there are several that are following on that. So this is happening on a small scale and increasingly a larger scale. We in the Northeast have largely been affected by small scale solar, but the next 5 to 10 years is absolutely mind-boggling, if that's not too strong a term, to see what projects are being planned, and a percentage of those plans will see fruition. They will be implemented, and our goal is to see animals on these sites and not lots and lots and lots of lawnmowers. I'm sure I don't need to make the case that we're trying to say, well, if we're doing solar to promote cleaner emissions, then it would be a slap in the face to have somebody come in with a lawnmower on a 1,000-acre site, and I don't need to give you the statistics, the numbers for CO2 emissions on a lawnmower versus a flock of sheep. Next slide. These are some of the organizations that we in ASCA have had some intimate dealings with, or collaborative dealings with, perhaps is a better word, and folks that we're still working with. You'll see there pollinators. I thought maybe it would be worth mentioning the promotion of some of these sites for pollinators. Obviously, it's a great means to rectify the loss of habitat throughout the country for pollinators, because of course our bee situation. I'm sure I don't need to make that case. So there's been a lot of efforts to use these sites, see these sites as means of promoting pollinators, seeding with species that promote that, whether it's bees, birds, butterflies, etc., etc. So we at ASCA have tried to sort of integrate that into our own mission, and we actually have been quite effective with that, and we've developed a couple of seed mixes now that are produced by Ernst Conservation Seeds in Erie, Pennsylvania, or Meadsville, I think technically, that we have been using now for a couple of years, that incorporate some pollinated species with some more conventional grasses and legumes, and the early data so far looks good in terms of how they're working. The long-term data is the jury's still out. I don't honestly know, I can't tell you how a site will look 5 years down the road after being grazed, in terms of the composition of that site. But the hope is that they will be effective. Some of our colleagues out in Minnesota, for example, have done a couple of years of testing on this using exclusively natives, a lot of pollinators, and seen terrific success, grazing quite heavily with sheep. So it's quite exciting what is happening there. So I think there's a lot of hope that with attentive management, that we can utilize sheep to manage pollinator species along with good grass or grazing species to keep everybody happy. Maybe that's too idealistic, but that's our goal. And as you can see there, the fuzz and buzz seed mix is actually the mixes that we at ASCA came up with and that are now being used on a commercial level. So I'll say that as a little push there. Next slide, please. And I thought about having a map of the US from a couple of years ago, actually 2018, to compare it to this one, because this one really shows how much shoulder grazing has expanded across the country. And although there is, as I say, in the yellow states, there is no data on solar grazing, we do know that there is some isolated solar grazing. The point is that, and I don't need to tell you, I mean, you can just see for yourself that there's an enormous amount of solar grazing going on in, I'm going to say that's probably 2/3 or 3/4 of the country. And I only see that increasing. So that's exciting. We're a big part of it in the Northeast. The Northeast is a hive of activity. New York, actually, I think, are the second most aggressive state in promoting it. And you in the North Country, I know you haven't seen a whole lot of it yet, I don't think, but I think you will. You're going to see significant amount of soil development in the next 5 years. I'm hoping that this little presentation, in addition to whatever else you've heard and will hear, will encourage you to either think about doing something yourself about it or talking to people who might be interested. I'm going to suggest you look into the ASCA website. I'm going to encourage you to become members, because that gives you access to all the data, including the web, the map, the grazing map that we're developing, and information like this. And we do presentations on a monthly basis. We do more casual, informal, what we call tea time presentations, where we talk about all the pertinent issues that are a part of this solar grazing phenomenon that we're becoming a part of. I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself here. What's the next slide, by the way, Kitty? Yeah, project location. I don't know how helpful that is, except I think it's what it does convey is that all those little bubbles, circles, the story, the message is that there's an enormous amount going on across a lot of the country in terms of solar grazing. So it's a sort of exciting time to be in. I know there are a lot of naysayers about solar development, and the more conspicuous they become, the more we hear disgruntlements and objectors and NIMBYs. If you're familiar with that term, we have a lot of NIMBYs. I don't know that I wouldn't say it's here to stay for a while, and I think we can exploit it to our good, and we do see that the notion of promoting agriculture, the continual use of agriculture in this land that's being taken over by panels. You know, I've heard farmers saying, well, we're losing all our land. And to some extent that does appear to be the case. But if we insist that land that's being lost to typical conventional agriculture can continue to be used productively in a different form of agriculture, because I mean the agriculture of where I come from in Scotland is mostly sheep or cattle grazing. That's what we don't see a lot of tractors running up and down fields. We see animals grazing. So that's the agriculture that I'm familiar with. A lot of folks like to see tractors, and that's okay too. But unfortunately, we're not going to see so much of that, but we are going to see, hopefully, potentially animals grazing. I'm going to anticipate that maybe some folks who would think or ask about, but we don't have that many sheep. And that is true. Particularly in the Northeast, we don't have that many sheep. If we are, I mean, when you start to look at some of the numbers, projected numbers of acres that may be under solar in the next 10 years, and the number of sheep that will be required to populate even 10% of those acres, we would need an enormous amount of sheep. And that is not, it's a formidable task, but it's not an impossible task. And there are folks throughout the country who are interested in helping with that. So I want to say that, throw it out to you folks to realize that it's not an insurmountable problem. And I had another thought, and now it's completely gone, and perhaps it'll come back later. Next slide, Kitty. And I guess I can let you read that a little bit. It's really telling the story of in the red down below. 1 megawatts requires approximately 6 to 7 acres of land. So you can do the math. The typical community solar development site that has been the more typical type of sites in the Northeast over the last 5 years has been a 2 to 5 megawatt site. So you can, in terms of size, you're looking at sort of 20 to 50 acres, and that is going to change enormously, and is changing enormously already. When you go out west, you'll see a totally different picture. Where you see solar, you see hundreds or thousands of acres under solar versus 10s and 20s and 30s. We're going to not necessarily duplicate, but we're going to look a lot more like the West in 10 years. I do think it's worth, yeah, I think probably it's worth just mentioning one little statistic, that to meet the most typical renewable energy targets that some of the states have set for themselves, the amount of land base that is required to reach those targets is not quite as formidable as it may seem. And it's generally 1 to 2% of the land base. So, you know, I've been in Pennsylvania recently where folks in a certain part of Pennsylvania were just fearful about losing thousands of acres of land. And I tried to contextualize a little bit by saying, well, actually, you know, it's not. It is a few thousand acres of land here and a few thousand acres there, but in the terms of the larger land base, and I think it'd be helpful to keep things in perspective. We tend to have a much more focused view on the world that we live in, but in the bigger scheme of things, that land base may not be as massive as we fear it might be. So I try to keep that in perspective. When even, I mean, I do get a little alarmed and concerned about some of the proposals that are being made, but the reality is that it's not going to mean that 3/4 of our land base is suddenly eventually going to go under solar panels. I don't think that's the case. The bottom part of that slide down there is we need more sheep, as I was just saying, and shepherds and shearers and processors. And I think one of the messages I wanted to try and get across to you folks who are listening is, even if you yourselves aren't directly interested in being a sheep producer or grazing sheep on the solar sites, I'm pretty confident that you will get more and more questions and interested people over the next few years, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to steer them in the right direction, and encourage them, actually, and don't say this is a ridiculous thing, because it's not ridiculous. It makes a lot of sense. If we do have some time for, I think we'll have some time for some questions. I'm hoping that folks can ask about, but what about this, what about that? Because that's good. I want this to be thought-provoking, but I'm hoping that there are answers to satisfy you too. Next one, Kitty. Probably more of the same in terms of we don't need to analyze it, but I mean, specifically that tells you specific solar grazers. And these are members of ASCA. What we consist of: solar grazers, we have enthusiasts, we have academic entities, we have solar development industry representatives too. That's about it right there. Next one. Yep. There's a site that some people like to see and some people don't like to see. For those of you who have been down to Penn State in the last year or so, 2 years, you may well have encountered some of these sites, which are all being, I think they're all being grazed at this juncture. No great surprise that Penn State have endorsed the concept of solar grazing. But that's a pretty substantial sized area there, you can see, over 500 acres. Next one. Another very, very large 350 megawatts site proposed in Niagara County, New York. And I'm guessing that's not too far from some of you folks. Is that right? I would think so. Whether this one will happen to the scale that it's being proposed at, I'm not sure, but that is quite typical of what we are seeing and what we're going to see, as I've been alluding to in the next 5 to 10 years. Next one. A big thank you from ASCA, from me, and from Nick. I did want to say, again, for what it's worth, is that ASCA are involved in a few grant funded projects right now. One of which is through NYSERDA, and we are doing some collecting of data in terms of soil health and soil fertility and forage quality in terms on sites that are being grazed versus sites that are not being grazed. So we can do some comparisons, and I think over the course of time, the grant will be finished in 2024, and we anticipate that we will be able to demonstrate that there is a positive trend because of the presence of sheep versus no sheep. And one other thing I wanted to mention too is we are just in the throes of collaborating on developing a nationwide grazing certification program, it's something that has to be regionalized because, as I mentioned earlier, grazing on a 1,000-acre site or a 2,000-acre site in Texas versus grazing on a site in the North Country where you guys are is pretty different. So we're developing a certification plan that will be somewhat regionalized, but ultimately will enable solar grazers to have some accreditation so that they can do the job properly and promote themselves and promote the industry. And we probably will see that come online before the end of this year. We've got North Carolina, we've got Penn State, I think Virginia Tech are involved with that too. So it's pretty cool. We've got some folks out in the West as well.
Jonathan,
at that point,
I see a question from Joe.
hi, Jonathan, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Okay, great. My question, and I'm sorry to interrupt the flow, but we have these sheep grazing underneath, and it's the Northeast. What do we end up doing with them, or what are people doing with them typically in the wintertime when we have hundreds of sheep and then we have to feed them throughout the winter? Are they feeding them on site? Are they bringing them to a different site? What's the typical ideas behind that?
Yep. Perfect question. And there's no one answer to that because there's lots of different scenarios. I mean, I know folks who have a flock of sheep that they only use for grazing on solar. Actually, they're usually cull ewes, and they'll graze them for a year and then sell them off and then buy another flock of cull ewes and graze them again. That's one scenario. And then we've got scenarios where folks are lambing on sites. But at this juncture, at least, most of the sheep producers who are grazing on solar sites are taking them off to their own farms off outside of the grazing season. When you go out further west, yes, there are folks who are keeping their sheep on site all year round, and they will provide supplementary feed as needed. But that is not typical for us here in the East yet. But as I've been saying, as sites get larger and larger, I personally think the best model, the most efficient model, is to make that solar site a solar farm. And there are some of the big developers who are much more interested in bringing sheep onto a site, putting a building up, having water available on site, i.e. a well, and basically making it a self-sustaining system. Bringing feed in as necessary, lambing on that site, on or off the site, depending on when you want to lamb. Basically, that solar site becomes a farm. But a lot of it depends on the size, the scale, the relationship between the sheep producer and the solar developer. But certainly, I think the scope for everything. I mean, I've put lambs, I bought lambs, and I put lambs on sites. I've put ewes and lambs on sites post lambing, and taken them off and taken them back and finish off the lambs outside of that. So lots of possibilities. Whatever works with your system. I don't want to sound simplistic about it, but you can do what you. I mean, some solar developing companies at this point prefer the idea of sheep being on the site only during the grazing season, i.e. late May, early May, perhaps through early November, and then take them off. But there are people who are keeping the sheep on longer than that. But there are different possibilities, and for the utility scale, I really do believe that the way to go is to keep those sheep on that site all year round.
I've got another question, Jonathan, from Andrea. Do the sheep need to be protected inside the solar array?
Yep, that's a great question too. I like all these questions because they bring up things that I forgot to bring up before. So it's interesting. Townships play a big role in solar development and the specifics of the solar farm or the solar site. And one of the issues has been trying to be in keeping with allowing wildlife access from wildlife into and out of these sites, which has presented a problem, namely the fences that they put up around these sites. And I think all solar companies now are required to put up a 7-foot fence around these sites. It sometimes means the fence at the bottom has a spacing which is too high that would allow either predators to get in or small sheep to get out, which is where very much so the sheep producer and we too, we are trying. I try and I emphasize the importance. If the solar company is interested at all in grazing sheep, don't do that. Don't give in to that pressure. I'll say it to township meetings too. It's really important that fence is to enable the sheep to stay in and for predators to stay out. So yes, I do know some people who are putting dogs on sites, guard dogs. I don't think that's the best way to go.
We've got another question from Lewis County. How do you manage soil fertility and new seedings and agronomic concerns like that?
Yeah, great question, and definitely one of the fields I'm particularly interested in myself personally. And this is why we like to be as proactive as possible from the earliest stages possible with the solar development company, because if they just go about their own devices, they will get the cheapest, everything the cheapest, including the grass mix that they'll seed on that site. They'll put in a cheap contractor's mix at the lowest rate possible, and you'll get rubbish varieties. And it's not that you can't graze sheep on rubbish, because I've seen sheep grazing on rubbish, but it's not that you get peak production. So it's just another way of saying promote good grazing mixes from the various earlier stages. Now, that's not to say that there will continue to be issues where sheep will go on sites that have already been seeded, and you'll have to make the best of it and improve it as things go on. And I'm sure you know that the presence of animals will improve the quality of the vegetation as time goes on. you're dealing sometimes, more often than not, actually, with scenarios where the vegetation might be very, very poor. But once again, and the grazing does change that. It changes the quality of the fertility. It can change the composition of grasses. So with a little bit of patience, you can turn things around in a hurry. It's one thing to take soil samples and say, my goodness, this solar site needs 5 tons of lime to the acre. That's probably not going to happen. It's the solar company doesn't care about that. They really don't care about fertility. Well, I shouldn't say ever, because there's always exceptions, but generally they don't care about that. We have to work within the context of the limitations that we have. But it's not an impossible situation. Just because, and I was in Scotland a week ago, and again, being up in the hills and seeing the sheep grazing on stuff that it just boggles your mind that they can look pretty good on that. It's amazing what sheep or any animals can thrive on. We can put a lot of emphasis on good nutrition, and that's all good, all to the good. But in the context of solar and getting animals on solar sites that may be substandard, we have to work with that within those constraints. Sometimes it's been cropped ground, it's been hayed ground. Sometimes it's been forested ground. And for those of you who are into soil health, well, the whole philosophy of soil health is to duplicate the soils of the forest. So we've got a lot to be working with there. I hope that helps. I'm very much into soil health and fertility, etc., etc. But there are times in which you have to work within the limitations of the scenario.
We have another question from Sully. Does your organization, ASGA, help connect sheep farmers with solar farms?
Absolutely. That's, I mean, the mapping tool that I made some mention of is an ever-evolving tool that has become extremely useful for sheep producers and for the solar industry. It's a little bit of a dig here. To gain access to that mapping tool, you have to be a member of ASGA. But you can go on the website. You can find all the details about ASGA. Become a subscriber. It's not expensive, but you do have access to an incredible amount of data, including the mapping tool, which has been extremely helpful for a lot of people. And that's an ever-changing, ever-growing, ever-evolving database.
So Sully has a follow-up question, and I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at here. So if you would like to unmute yourself and ask Jonathan directly, that might work best. Do you know how to do that?
Yeah.
There you go.
So I guess I was just from like start to finish. So if someone joins, becomes a member and is interested in connecting with the solar farm, generally, what is the time frame? Like, what would be the process of joining and then getting sheep onto or into a solar farm?
Yeah, and as I was saying, Sully, the bigger the farm, the bigger the solar site, the longer it takes to get started. The permitting becomes more and more complex. And Kitty just, I think, mentioned earlier when we were talking that you've been involved in some townships, is that right? Or some boards where you're discussing.
County, yeah. County planning board, yeah.
And that can become a pretty complex issue, and can take a lot of time, because there's a lot of people who are unhappy, who have objections, good objections. So without blethering on about that, yes, it can take a year or 2 or even 3 years. In fact, we have a project up in Seneca County, New York, that has been in process. It's a 700-acre project that's been in process for well over 3 years now. I met with some of the landowners, and I've heard some of the neighbors' objections. They're not illegitimate, but also I don't think they're entirely accurate. Eventually, this project will happen. I'm absolutely certain of it. The other thing I wanted to say about that is, from my experience so far, the sooner you can develop a relationship with some representative of the solar company, it is all to the good. Also with the landowners themselves, if they are interested and receptive and sympathetic to somebody putting sheep on their site, then that goes a long way, because they're working with the solar company. If they tell the solar company, I would like to have sheep put on this site, that really helps a lot. The message I'm trying to get across is that if you know, the sooner you know, the better, and the sooner you make contact with the solar development company or the landowner, because they can put you in contact with the right people, to say that you're interested, it's all to the good.
I would
So
think,
there's no simple answer to that story, Solly, but it may take a year, it may take 3 years.
I would think on top of that, Sully, your local township and your county
Yep.
has lists of already existing arrays, and they know who the developers were. If they've changed hands, they may or may not know about that, but they may be able to connect you or give you some idea how to connect with the ones that already exist.
Great.
And
Thank you.
I'll say this, Sully. There's a project that I've just started to get
You
a
guys
little bit
can call me
involved.
Brandy. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Oh.
Sorry.
That's my last name nickname.
Okay. So I've been getting a little bit involved in a 1,200 acre project in northeast Pennsylvania, and there were 2 members of the township who were very vocal objectors of the proposal, and it was suddenly proposed to them somewhat out of the blue, because a lot of the land was agricultural. It was already in agricultural production. Somebody said, well, what if we graze sheep on these sites? And right away, their attitude changed. And they became somewhat more receptive. So I say that because that may be the only reason that people hold back. They just don't want to see these capitalistic solar developers come in and make a lot of money on the backs of people who are not making a lot of money.
I'm gonna throw
Anybody
one.
got anything else?
Yeah, I've got a quick one. If another question is, are they still doing these smaller solar arrays as far as the 20 acre ones?
Yes.
And what if you wanted to get involved in start to finish? Like you had 20 acres that was open field. You were interested in not only grazing the sheep, but actually, becoming the solar farmer, if you will. How do you get involved in that? And is there a place to start?
So were you suggesting that you yourself as a landowner would do the development yourself?
Well, would be interested in working with somebody, but yes.
Yes. So yes, there's dozens and dozens of solar development companies, from still on the community scale all the way up to the utility scale, and I absolutely see community scale solar continuing for the next few years. There are just some who are moving more and more towards the bigger sites, but yes, absolutely. In fact, the company I work for, in addition to the big sites, we're building multiple 30 to 50 acre sites right now. Again, the Asker website is actually a very useful site, because you can find out a lot of the companies who are doing work, and who are growing. The IDA in your area may also be a good resource, because they probably have been contacted, in addition to what Kitty was saying, because a lot of these companies are regularly communicating with counties, with townships, and so there's lots of ways to find out where these folk are coming from, and they're from all over the country. I mean, there's solar companies from all over the country who are moving into, in this case, New York, as well as New York companies. So I don't know how helpful that is, Joe. I mean, I myself, just because I have a network. I mean, there's always networks, but I can't sort of write down a dozen names for you. I will say quite comfortably that if you would become a member of Asker for whatever it is, I think $70 or something, you would automatically access a lot of the solar development companies who would be people you might want to contact.
Thank you.
see
That's
there's-
perfect. Thank you.
Good, Joe. I am on the planning board up here, not in your county, but to your north. And we see these things come before the planning board almost every month, one or two. And our planning department keeps track of where they are and who the developers were. And I would imagine your county does exactly the same thing. So you could also reach out to them and see if they could share some information with you. I
Thank
see
you. That's a
St.
good plan.
Yep. St. Lawrence County there. Kayla, you have your hand up.
Zeus, I'll talk here. I have quite a few questions for him. Because we have a small array and we have a little bit of experience with grazing sheep. And we had 1 year in it, and I'm just got a few questions. I do agree with follow-up. We had a good relationship with the solar company because we grazed our sheep on this array in our property last year. And this year, they'd like us to do a half a dozen more if we could, which we're not going to do, which brings me to my first question. How do you graze and manage sheep that are half an hour or an hour from your home? I mean, you talked about that person in Ohio getting with a big acreage development. I mean, you're an hour away. I mean, we had sites of, would have been half an hour, and that distance seems like it's insurmountable.
Yep. Yep. That's another great question. And actually it's one of the questions that we've been wrestling with for a couple of years. And when I talk to folks I know who want to graze sites, and they'll contact me and say, do you have any sites close to me? And I say, well, how close is close enough? And it varies according to the size of the flock they have and the size of the site, and frankly, how much the company might be willing to pay. And I'm assuming that the site that you grazed, you were compensated for, because I would say that's quite important. It shouldn't be undervalued, because those companies have to pay. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to bring me another question. I don't interrupt you, but I want to bring my next question.
Yeah.
So how are we with competing with mowers, lawn mowers? I mean,
Yep.
are we cheaper? Are we more expensive? Or how do we compete with them price wise, to the developer?
Yeah. Good hard facts on what's the cash value of all this. And it's a moving target. It's been a moving target for the last 5 years. It's become quite competitive. I mean, I was dealing with a company out of California who are managing sites in New York, and they'll tell me, well, you've got to be cheaper. You've got to be cheaper than the lawnmowers. And my instinctive response to that is, well, why? But that's the way things go, isn't it? I'm not sure I've finished with your first question yet. How far? And it's like, yes, it's really good to know what the costs are of putting sheep on a solar site, and one of the significant costs is hauling them and then checking on them. And the rule of thumb, I would say, for a relatively small site is an hour, up to an hour. And again, then you have to say, well, do I have water on the site? Do I have to haul water? How many times should I be checking them? Lots of questions. All those questions are based on what it's costing me money. It's costing me money to run out there every time. It's costing money to run out there with water. I really can't tell you how far you should go or could go. I think you can start with what you should be getting paid, and then figure out how many acres you've got to graze. So let's just say you've got a 20-acre site, and a conservative figure I would say is $350 per acre per year. Do your math from that. I know folks who are getting paid a little bit less than that, and I know folks who are getting paid quite a bit more than that. The general range for what somebody can realistically charge is $300 to $500 per acre per year. And some of the lawnmower guys are coming in a little bit less than that. And so that's where it comes back to, what is the virtue, what is the benefit of having sheep versus lawnmowers? And there are some solar companies who say, yes, there's a benefit, or politically it's better for me to have sheep versus lawnmowers. There are lots of scenarios. I'm sorry, there's no easy answer to your question. If you had 500 sheep and you were grazing 200 acres, I think you can probably travel at least an hour. A friend of mine in Missouri, he was probably grazing about 7,000 or 8,000 acres and probably 10,000 sheep. And he was cutting back and he was saying, I'm not going to graze anything less than 200 acres from home. I'm sorry, 200, I beg your pardon, 200 miles from home. Well, you know, it's like that was a bit, I was flabbergasted by that. Somehow, and he was a businessman, I respected him. He could justify 200 miles. So I think the more facts you have at your disposal in terms of the cost of doing this, I think the number one is water, having a good handling system, and having a plan. You know, if you can avoid bringing those sheep back to your home more than once, all to the good. If you can graze them if you can take them to multiple sites, it makes it more efficient from what site to site to site. Graze it down, take them off, move them on. I could go on about that. I don't know if I'm being more helpful by saying these things, because I think there's a huge opportunity there. If you've got access to multiple sites, there's a huge opportunity to generate some revenue from that.
You got more there, Kayla?
I have several like that if there's time. Well, I would think to get the best results in the array, you have to do some kind of rotational grazing, I would
Yep.
think.
Yep.
So, does it get, I mean, you talked about scale, but it almost seems to me, because we were doing this on 15 acres with like 40, 50 sheep, and it almost seemed unmanageable. Thus, of course, we didn't know what we were doing very well, perhaps, but it would just seem to me when you would get such a big scale that would just almost get unmanageable. To try to rotate them through properly, because if you can rotate them through properly, you know as well as you can eliminate the mowing then. I would, most of the time. We had to mow once last year because we didn't have enough sheep in there early enough that we had to mow it once to get. But I would think if you have to really rotate them through intensely. If you could do that, then you can then eliminate the mowing. It just seems to me that would get unmanageable after it's so big.
So yes, I mean, yes, it can eliminate the mowing completely. And the manageability factor is all about how much you're willing to do. If you've got one site, if you've got one single site, and you can graze that down, and it's controlled by August, then take them off that site. But the ideal thing is if you can take them onto another site, and maybe bring them back in October to clean up again. I certainly couldn't tell you how you could do it, but I think there's so many different ways to do it. And it's all about how much you want to put into the management factor, because that's big. That's the bigger it is, the bigger the management factor. I mean, we've got folk in Vermont who are probably grazing 20 sites, and it's a challenge, but they've grown into it, if you will.
It would seem to me you're going to have them grazed by mid-June, all of them, because if not, you're going to be shading. That's what we ended the trouble with. They started getting a little bit of shade, and they wanted to mow at the end of June or July. So you're going to have to be through all them arrays by mid-June, and then have shading, right?
Yeah. So what I do on some sites that I have now is I'll rotate our animals onto all the sites I'm grazing for a week or two or three, get that grass down to a reasonable level, and then bring them back to where they started. And so I am moving them quite a lot. And I think you'll probably find that sheep become more and more accustomed, just like when you're moving them from paddock to paddock. Sheep become quite accustomed to being loaded up onto a truck and loaded off a truck. I don't personally like having to move sheep more than I absolutely want to, or I don't think it's good for them. But sometimes for the early grazing management, that might be the best way to go. Unless you don't mind mowing, if you've got multiple sites to manage.
One more question, and you had said there's incentives for the developer to put sheep in there. Are there incentives for sheep farmers to put sheep in there, such as, is there any kind of funding for water systems, for perimeter, or for fencing and inside, to divide it up? Is there any funding from anybody for the farmer for that?
Well, we have approached that question, and we have talked to NRCS about that, and NRCS actually would be willing to look at that, but ultimately it comes down to the solar developer themselves and how invested they might be in what you're proposing. I think again, coming back to the water system, I mean, I've drilled a few wells on some sites. It's really nice to have a well on a site versus filling up a tank every couple of weeks. Whether the solar company themselves are willing to help you with that is usually a reflection on how supportive and sympathetic they are to the needs of animals, the needs of agriculture. But again, but for them, all they really are concerned about is vegetation management. They don't really care. And I shouldn't say, there are always exceptions, but generally it is about what's it going to cost me? What's my least cost alternative? And until we can make the case for more and more solar developers that there might be some virtues to having sheep versus lawnmowers, it's going to be cost. It's going to be bottom line.
That's all I got.
Anybody got anything else? How you doing there in your room, Melissa?
Oh, we're good. They don't have any more questions.
Okay, okay. Thank you for coming, Andrea. I don't